Welcome to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, CharlesGruver. And last time, we briefly looked at the life of Isaac Watts, and this week, pretty much another brief, short episode. We will go a little bit deeper into his legacy regarding his contributions to the Christian landscape. In regards to his contribution to, or basically just some of his contributions. In regards to the main reason why I had chosen him, his contribution to English hymnody, or hymn writing, it helps to kind of understand the tradition of music and worship up to this point. The older tradition was pretty much the use of psalms, which, when you look at it, date back to the Old Testament, with David writing the Psalms and having using the Levites to help perform them as part of temple worship. And that practice pretty much continued on through into the New Testament, and even in some of the books in the New Testament, it talks about, as part of our worship, using the Psalms as a method of worshiping. What Watts did was he actually kind of was part of leading a change in the practice to include actually new poetry to make original songs that expressed a Christian view. Although Watts was not the first Protestant to promote the use of hymns in worship, it's actually because of his prolific hymn writing that he actually was one of the major characters and probably the most influential in helping to usher in this new era of worship, as other poets tended to follow his lead. He also introduced a way of rendering the Psalms into verse by adapting them for hymns with a Christian perspective, claiming pretty much that the Psalms should be imitated in the language of the New Testament. So in other words, he would create paraphrases of the Psalms that would actually, and other biblical passages, which was another common practice, to use paraphrases of biblical texts to create hymns and songs for worship. One thing I was hoping to do was kind of go into the story behind maybe one or two of his hymns. The only thing is the only hymn that I know of, that I've heard of for being popular, that there's really any sort of story behind, was Joy to the World. But two examples of what is probably two of his most famous hymns, one I've heard of, the other one I haven't, although from what I've read, and you can see through the links I'll have in the show notes, it's evidently one of his hymns that's actually performed quite often for various reasons, and is also considered the anthem of the Christian church. The two hymns are When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, which is the one that I've heard of. The other one is Our God, Our Help in Ages Past, or as John Wesley renamed it, O God, Our Help in Ages Past. And both Our God and O God are basically equally popular and equally used. Wondrous Cross serves as an example of his using new poetry and making original songs, as it was an innovative departure from the style of using only paraphrased biblical texts for writing hymns. And some people actually think that When I Survey the Wondrous Cross is actually one of his finest hymns. I know Chris Tomlin and Tim Hughes have pretty much done versions of it as far as modern stuff goes, and that's probably where I've been more familiar with it, is hearing the more modern versions from one of them two being used in church service. The other hymn, Our God, Our Help in Ages Past, is the one that I had noticed was considered at times to be the anthem of the church, and has been used numerous times for various occasions. This hymn is pretty much an example of him taking one of the Old Testament Psalms and paraphrasing it. This one was a paraphrase, essentially, of Psalm 90, giving Psalm 90 more of a Christian worldview to it. He also wrote a number of hymns and poems that were geared towards children. He was often containing teachings within them, such as teachings on gratitude and piety, as well as teachings that expressed views against laziness and quarreling. Again, examples of these can be found in the links within the show notes. Besides writing poetry and hymns, Watts was also a theologian and logician, writing books and essays on these subjects, including what was probably, for a while, the textbook on logic that was used in various universities such as Oxford, Yale, Harvard, and the textbook was aimed for beginners and was actually arranged methodically, broken down into 4 parts on perception, judgment, reasoning, and method, which those 4 parts, in the notes that I saw where they talked about it, they talked about how he actually had each of those parts broken down into smaller and smaller, into logically smaller and smaller chunks that basically built on one another. But again, as I said, this was kind of another brief look, surprisingly, for what is probably, again, one of the most influential people in English hymn writing. There wasn't really a whole lot of information other than, there's like the whole anecdote that I'd mentioned when I did the episode on Joy to the World about how at a young age, showing his displeasure in regards to the framework of hymns and songs used within worship as he was growing up, complaining to his father about it. His father basically went and told him to, if he didn't like it, to try his hand at doing better, which is pretty much what led him into writing poetry and the hymns that he wrote. But Again, this is CharlesGruver. That was kind of the contribution to that Isaac Watts had, and that's God at Work. God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith, is brought to you by Becoming God's Man Ministries, and is written and produced by CharlesGruver. If you have any questions, comments, or stories of how God has worked in your life that you would like to share, you can contact us at stories@godatworkpodcast.com or by leaving a voicemail or texting 727-315-0830. If you would like to support God at Work or Becoming God's Man Ministries, you can find out how by going to either godatworkpodcast.com or becominggodsman.com. Opening theme is Fine Line, and closing theme is Airline, both by Geographer and obtained from the YouTube audio library. And as always, thank you for listening.